The air shifted the moment he appeared, an unmistakable tension threading through the polished marble and whispered conversations. No one announced him, but every glance tightened, every movement slowed, as if the very room held its breath. In a place built on trust and privilege, his presence was treated like a disruption, a question unanswered. Yet beneath the quiet watchfulness, a force simmered, one that would upend expectations and reveal a truth the bank never saw coming. This isn't just a tale of quiet injustice. It's a reckoning waiting to unfold. If you're ready to uncover what happens when power wears an unexpected face, like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from and what you think lies ahead in the comments. Your perspective shapes the story. Everett keeps his head down slightly as he walks, an instinct drilled into him from years of navigating spaces where he was seen before he was heard. The lobby is filled with polished marble floors that reflect harsh overhead lights, giving every surface a cold, sterile shine. Business people in sleek suits move briskly, their conversations clipped and confident, their steps echoing on the floor. He doesn't hurry to match them. He moves deliberately, every step measured to keep his posture straight, shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to avoid seeming servile, but not enough to appear confrontational. The old satchel creaks faintly with each step, the smell of worn leather rising to his nose like an old memory. On the flap, the silver monogram is scratched nearly beyond recognition, but it's carefully cleaned, polished by habit, if not hope. At the counter, he waits patiently behind a man in a sharply tailored navy suit who laughs comfortably with the teller. She leans forward toward the man, nails perfectly manicured, smiling with practiced warmth. When Everett steps up next, the smile tightens, flickering just long enough to make its shift obvious. Her gaze darts down to the old satchel, lingering a moment on his frayed cuffs before returning to meet his eyes with forced professionalism. He gently places the paperwork on the counter, tapping the silver clip to keep the sheets aligned. The clip is old, tarnished, but it holds the papers firm and unwrinkled. She picks it up slowly, examining it longer than necessary, flipping each page as if searching for mistakes that don't exist. Everett stands silently, fingers lightly drumming the satchel's edge. He can feel the security guard's gaze pressing into his back like a warning. The bank's cool air hums with the buzz of fluorescent lights and the soft click of keyboards. The line behind him shifts restlessly, shoes scuffing the marble. The teller finally sets his paperwork aside, not in the neat pile of VIP forms, but onto a scuffed side counter, slightly sticky from neglect. She tells him to wait, not offering him one of the comfortable armchairs near the premium window, but gesturing vaguely toward the bolted plastic chairs lining the drafty entrance. He nods once, mouth tightening, and walks slowly to the chair, his old shoes squeaking faintly. He lowers himself carefully, as if the hard plastic might shatter beneath him. His satchel rests in his lap like an anchor. The security guard takes 2 steps closer, arms folded now, eyes steady, a subtle shake of the head warning him not to move too fast. Everett focuses on his breathing. Inhale, exhale. His scar itches with memory. He resists the urge to rub it, knowing too well what it looks like when a black man fidgets under surveillance. His gaze wanders around the lobby, catching glimpses of people in private glass offices being served drinks in branded paper cups, their laughter hushed but real. Across the room, a family is ushered to a roped-off section with plush chairs, children giggling, parents murmuring about investment plans. No one looks at him. He can see his reflection in the bank's tall glass walls. A slim man in middle age with lines of worry at the corners of his mouth. The clothes of someone who knows how to preserve things. The posture of someone who has learned not to take up too much space. The teller's voice is smooth again when calling the next guest. She leans forward once more, eyes bright, voice dipped in sugar. The line shuffles forward without hesitation. Everett watches it, eyes dull. The security guard clears his throat, low and deliberate, a tiny sound that says, "Remember you're being watched." Everett doesn't look at him. Instead, he smooths the flap of his bag, brushing over the cracks in the leather as though apologizing to it for bringing it here. Minutes pass like hours. The air grows colder where he sits, each draft from the automatic door cutting into him like a judgment. He adjusts his shirt cuffs, making sure the scar is hidden. He shifts once on the hard seat, drawing the security guard's attention immediately. Their eyes meet for half a second. The guard doesn't blink. Everett looks away first. He knows better. The bank has grown quieter in that insidious way of places where no one wants a scene, but everyone notices. Conversations lower when they drift his way. A child glances at him curiously before being tugged away gently by her mother. A businessman walking past gives him a once-over and looks right through him. The teller's eyes keep flicking toward him, checking that he hasn't moved, that he stayed exactly where they told him to. He obeys. He's good at obeying. It's a survival mechanism more than courtesy. He's been trained by countless small humiliations in spaces just like this. Everett knows this role well, the man who waits, who doesn't complain. Conversations muted to whispers when they passed him. Laughter stifled. Even the mechanical chime of the ticketing system seemed to adopt a condescending rhythm, its cheerful beep incongruous in a space that had turned so hostile. He tried to remember the last time he had felt truly welcome anywhere like this. It was difficult. The tellers at the VIP counter continued their work with brisk efficiency, handling paperwork with bright smiles and warm voices, but only for those who fit the mold. A young couple with matching tailored suits laughed with the banker, who offered them branded water bottles and financial advice, as if they were old friends. Everett watched them from across the room, feeling both invisible and painfully obvious. When a new line formed at the regular counter, he was pointedly ignored. A clerk who had glanced at him turned away without a nod. Her expression shuddered, as though he were not even there. He had seen this before. It wasn't new, but the sting hadn't dulled over the years. He had thought, foolishly, that today might be different. He had dressed carefully, pressed his shirt until the lines were sharp. He had wiped every stain he could find off his old shoes. He had organized his paperwork meticulously, clipped it neatly in that old silver clasp that had held so many promises over the years. None of it mattered. They saw the wearer in the fabric, the age in the satchel, the history written in the creases around his eyes and the thin scar on his wrist. They saw what they wanted to see. He glanced once toward the teller who had sent him away. She was laughing now with a man in a fine gray coat. She had leaned forward slightly, elbows on the counter, her posture relaxed and intimate in that professional way designed to make the right kind of customer feel welcome. Everett's stomach turned at the memory of how her face had hardened when it was his turn. No warmth, no humor, just suspicion cloaked in forced courtesy. He remembered her eyes flicking over his clothes, his satchel, his skin. He remembered how she had placed his paperwork to the side with a finality that had felt like a door slamming shut. When another banker came over to the counter, she gestured toward Everett with a flick of her fingers, so subtle he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so carefully. The second banker didn't even try to hide the way his eyes slid over Everett dismissively before turning back to his colleague with a half-smile. They shared a quick, private word that made her laugh again, a sound carefully muffled but unmistakable. He felt it in his bones. The joke was about him. He looked down at his hands, brown skin marked with age and work, and adjusted his shirt cuffs again to hide the scar. He pressed his thumb against the silver monogram on his satchel, feeling its grooves dig into the pad of his finger, a small pain to ground him. He reminded himself that he had come here for a reason. He had business to do, just like everyone else. But it didn't feel like he belonged here. It felt like every aspect of the room had been arranged to remind him of that. Even the chairs told the story. He understood that a black man in a white space had to prove he wasn't angry just to be left alone. He forced his expression into calmness, even though his gut twisted with shame. A teller called another name from the line, a young man in a tailored suit who breezed past Everett without a glance. The teller smiled widely at the newcomer, leaning forward to take his documents with both hands, voice soft and conspiratorial, as if they shared a private joke about the world's rules. Everett felt a pang in his chest. He shifted slightly on the chair, and the motion earned him an instant reaction. The security guard straightened from his post, thumb brushing the clip on his baton. The movement was subtle but deliberate, a silent promise of force. Everett froze, willing his muscles to go slack. His eyes dropped to the floor. He felt sweat collecting at his hairline despite the chilly air. No sudden moves. That was the rule. No reason to look threatening. The guard kept watching anyway. Across the lobby, the two tellers at the VIP desk leaned together for a moment, heads angled just so, their eyes cutting briefly in Everett's direction. They didn't bother to hide their exchange. One of them straightened with a little sniff, smoothing her blouse and flipping her hair behind her shoulder. She called for someone else in line, her voice ringing with renewed cheer. Everett's chest tightened. His paperwork was still resting on the dusty side counter where she'd left it, ignored while others were processed one after another. He could see the edge of the papers curling slightly in the dry air, the old silver clip dulled to a matte gray. He had spent half the night making sure every document was in order. He'd checked dates, signatures, balances. He had wanted to walk in here with dignity. Now he felt ridiculous. He thought about getting up to ask, but the idea died as soon as the security guard shifted again. Everett glanced at him from under his lashes. The guard's eyes were flat and heavy, mouth set in a straight line that spoke of boredom edged with suspicion. No, Everett decided. He wouldn't make a scene. That was the fastest way to lose. He sat back against the chair, feeling its unforgiving edge dig between his shoulder blades. The other customers flowed around him, careful not to make eye contact, skirts and coats brushing his knees like he was part of the furniture. When another teller walked past carrying a sheaf of forms, she paused near the side desk and plucked Everett's paperwork from the top of the pile. She examined it briefly, nose wrinkling in apparent confusion. Without even looking around to see who it belonged to, she handed it off to a colleague with a low mutter. The colleague frowned and began paging through the forms slowly, flipping each page with exaggerated care as if it might conceal a threat. Everett watched, heat flooding his face. The staff's faces were calm, professional, but their actions told the real story. They didn't trust it. They didn't trust him. They weren't embarrassed to show it. A hush settled over the line behind him as the second teller held up his paperwork and conferred with a manager who had appeared from a glass-walled office. The manager wore a tailored navy suit that glinted under the bank's sterile lights. He took Everett's forms, flipping through them with precise fingers, his eyes unreadable. The teller said something too low to catch. The manager nodded once. Everett's chest constricted. They were talking about him, about whether he was allowed to be here, whether his business was real. He felt the weight of all the eyes in the room, even those pretending not to watch, leaning in with unspoken questions. Who is he? What is he trying to do? Is it legitimate? Is he? The manager finally handed the paperwork back, lips pressed in. The teller's mouth twitched with a brief smile of apology that didn't reach her eyes. She took the forms back to her station, placing them on yet another pile. This one behind the desk where Everett couldn't see. Everett fought the urge to wipe the sweat from his brow. He didn't want to draw attention to his discomfort, didn't want to show weakness or resistance. He'd learned that a long time ago, that they were watching for a reason to escalate. He wasn't going to give them one. Still, he could feel his dignity shrinking, an almost physical sensation like someone tightening a belt around his chest. Across the lobby, the VIP line moved fluidly, a steady dance of welcoming smiles and polite laughter. A woman in a cream-colored pantsuit leaned forward at the counter, resting an expensive handbag on the polished wood, and the teller responded with an animated nod, tapping the screen while exchanging knowing banter. Everett watched them, unable to look away, the contrast between their interaction and his own so stark it burned. When he dared glance back at his own counter, he caught sight of his paperwork being flipped again, this time with less care. A teller snapped the silver clip off, papers splaying out, and she sighed with exasperation before shoving them back together with all the grace of a butcher packaging meat. She didn't even look at Everett as she did it. She handed the papers off to a colleague without a word, as though they were contaminated. Everett's ears burned. His mouth felt dry as he swallowed, focusing on a point on the floor that had a faint hairline crack running through the tiles. He tracked the line with his eyes like it was the only thing that might anchor him here, keep him from standing and demanding answers. But that wasn't an option. Demanding was dangerous. He'd seen it before. He'd seen what happened to people who didn't know when to stop asking. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, turning to an ache that threatened to spread through his entire body. He forced a breath in and out, shallow, careful. The guard shifted closer, boots creaking on the marble. Everett felt the man's shadow fall over him, his gaze like a physical force that pressed him deeper into the chair. Around him, other customers shifted uncomfortably, not out of empathy, but to avoid getting drawn in. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat and angled his body away, clearly hoping not to be associated with whatever trouble might be brewing. A mother took her young daughter by the hand, guiding her firmly to the other side of the lobby as the little girl craned her neck to stare. Everett pretended not to see them, staring now at the edge of his satchel where the stitching had begun to unravel. He remembered when it was new. He remembered the pride he'd felt buying something he couldn't really afford at the time, telling himself it would last a lifetime. He remembered how hard he'd worked to prove he deserved even that small bit of quality. Now, it felt like evidence against him. Another teller approached the main counter, glancing at Everett's crumpled forms with thinly veiled annoyance before loudly announcing that the signature needed verification. Her voice was calm but pitched just loud enough for the line behind Everett to hear. Heads turned. A murmur rose and fell like a wave. Everett felt the heat crawl up his neck, his pulse thrumming behind his ears. He forced himself not to react, even as the teller scowled, tapping the papers with a single sharp finger before turning and striding back to the printer. He could see the glances people cast at him, their brows creased with suspicion or worse, pity. The sound of polite conversation in the lobby didn't stop, but it changed. It became more guarded, more curious. Everett could feel himself being catalogued, weighed, and found wanting. He tried to remember what he had written on those forms that could possibly warrant this treatment. Nothing, of course. Nothing but the sum of who he was. The security guard cleared his throat again, a short, barking sound that startled Everett enough to make him jump slightly in his chair. That was enough for the people around him to recoil further. A woman in a navy dress let out a soft, disapproving sigh before turning back to her phone with exaggerated focus. The teller returned, dropping his forms on the counter without looking at him, announcing in a flat voice that there were discrepancies that needed management approval. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Everett's mouth went dry. He felt their curiosity like a hot brand pressed to the back of his neck, everyone wondering what he'd done, what kind of trouble he was here to cause. The teller didn't invite him to the main counter, but jerked her chin toward a side desk, one that looked barely used, its surface scuffed and dulled from neglect. He moved obediently, placing his satchel down and opening it slowly to retrieve his ID once more, careful to make no sudden gestures. The guard followed at a measured distance, arms folded now across his chest, mouth set in a flat line that promised nothing but consequences. Everett handed over his ID, the worn edges soft from years of use, the laminate starting to curl at one corner. The teller pinched it between two fingers like something distasteful, flipping it over twice before setting it down with an audible tap on the grimy surface. She asked him to wait again, voice calm but clipped, as if granting him a kindness he didn't deserve. She didn't bother lowering her voice as she turned to speak to another teller about needing to double-check his signature. Everett felt the words pierce like needles. They said more than they needed to. They said he was suspicious, that he was the sort of man who needed watching, that even his name written in his own hand couldn't be trusted without question. He stood there, fingers drumming lightly on his satchel in a rhythm that betrayed his strain, his teeth pressing together so hard his jaw began to ache. He tried to meet the eyes of no one, tried to make himself smaller even as he stood, knowing any flicker of frustration would be read as threat. The security guard's position shifted slightly, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, knees relaxed, ready. Everett noticed every detail of that stance, the practiced ease of someone prepared to subdue. He swallowed against the dry scrape in his throat and forced himself to breathe evenly. Around him, the rest of the bank continued its polite, orderly life. A mother rocked a baby stroller gently while texting with her free hand. A man in a tailored suit took a call near the window, voice low and urgent, but entirely unafraid. The VIP counter bustled with soft, welcoming laughter as the staff poured complimentary bottled water and made careful notes of large deposits. Everett was not invited to any of that. He was corralled here at the shabby side counter, like livestock in a pen. When the manager finally appeared, he was a tall, slim man with sleek hair and a tailored navy jacket, the kind of person who projected authority without raising his voice. He didn't greet Everett. He didn't smile. He simply asked to see the paperwork in a tone that was more command than request. Everett handed it over wordlessly, the silver clip catching the light before being pried off with casual disdain. The manager spread the papers out, scanning them with a critical eye, not even pretending to hide the suspicion on his face. He asked Everett to confirm his address and birth date, slow and pointed, each question biting with its implication. Everett answered quietly, clearly, voice steady despite the thunder of blood in his ears. He felt stripped bare with every answer. The manager nodded once and turned to confer with the teller in low tones, their conversation drifting back just enough for Everett to catch words like verification, suspicious, and policy. He clenched the strap of his satchel so tightly it dug into the heel of his palm. The manager's voice was calm when he turned back, but it was the calm of a verdict, not of reassurance. He informed Everett that due to inconsistencies and the need for verification, his transaction would be delayed indefinitely. Everett felt the words crash over him like a wave of ice. He knew what they really meant. It meant they didn't want his business. His mouth quirked in the barest hint of disdain, like he found the entire situation boring but necessary. Everett didn't return the stare. He stared at the cracked vinyl of his chair instead, thumb brushing over the seam until the friction burned. He knew better than to invite further scrutiny. He had learned the cost of being perceived as confrontational. His eyes flickered to the counter where his paperwork had been discarded. The forms were now buried under other transactions, out of sight and out of mind. He had no claim to them anymore. They weren't lost, they had been buried on purpose. He couldn't forget how the teller's fingers had pinched his ID like it was contaminated, how she had wiped her hands without thought as soon as it left them. The memory scraped at him like sandpaper, leaving raw patches he couldn't soothe. Meanwhile, the bank carried on in an unbroken performance of luxury and comfort for everyone else. A group of clients laughed softly with a banker, heads close together in easy intimacy. A man in a designer overcoat was offered a complimentary coffee from a machine behind the VIP desk, the steam rising gently between polished brass accents as he accepted it with casual thanks. The teller handed it to him with both hands, bowing her head just enough to telegraph respect. Everett watched the whole exchange, an uninvited witness to what civility was supposed to look like here. His own interactions had been anything but. He shifted slightly in the chair, the movement small but enough to draw the guard's attention. The man's fingers tapped against his forearm in a silent rhythm of readiness. Everett dropped his eyes immediately. He adjusted his satchel on his knees, the cracked leather creaking in the hushed space. He felt the weight of it, not just the physical heft of old papers and necessities, but the metaphorical burden of being told, without words, that he was the problem here. His skin itched with awareness of the way other customers avoided looking at him directly. A woman in a navy dress stepped around his chair with an exaggerated arc, pressing her purse closer to her body, as if worried it might brush against him. She didn't meet his eyes, didn't acknowledge him at all. To her, he was furniture to be navigated around. At the VIP counter, the teller who had processed him now spoke with another client, her voice warm, melodic, her body language completely transformed. She leaned in, laughed at a joke Everett couldn't hear, her fingers resting lightly on the counter in a display of easy trust. She radiated welcome and competence, a model of the bank's brand. But that performance hadn't been for him. When she turned, Everett could see her expression flatten for just an instant as her eyes passed over him. a flicker of contempt she didn't bother to hide. He felt heat climb his neck, pooling in his ears. His teeth ground together silently. But he didn't move. He didn't dare. He stayed rooted to the chair, fingers white around the satchel's handle. His eyes burned with a sting of unwanted moisture, which he refused to let fall. He blinked hard, willing the sensation away. A child tugged at their mother's coat, pointing in Everett's direction with the blunt curiosity of someone too young to know better. The mother hushed them quickly and steered them away, avoiding even a glance at him, as if eye contact might somehow invite trouble. Everett felt something in his chest fold in on itself. The teller's laughter carried across the lobby again, bright and ringing. As she offered the next guest a small courtesy Everett hadn't even been offered the chance to refuse. The contrast was sharp enough to wound. He shifted again, making the chair's legs scrape against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the muted space. The security guard's gaze sharpened immediately, his stance tightening, hand dropping automatically to rest against his belt near the baton. Everett froze. He held his breath for 2 beats before letting it out carefully, deliberately slow. The guard relaxed by degrees, though his eyes stayed locked on Everett with the weight of a promise. One wrong move, one wrong word, and everything would change. The teller at the counter whispered something to her colleague, who turned to glance directly at Everett with raised eyebrows, then looked away with a small, knowing smirk. The conversation was private, but the message was public. Everett didn't belong here. Instead, his world had narrowed to the chill that seeped through his shirt collar, the pressure of the satchel strap against his palm, and the constant, suffocating presence of the security guard posted nearby. The guard's eyes rarely drifted, maintaining a steady, unreadable focus that suggested readiness to pounce at the faintest provocation. Everett was no threat, but that didn't matter here. He'd learned that what mattered was the story people wanted to see, and in this room, he was the interloper who needed monitoring. He pressed his lips together, feeling the dryness crack the thin skin, tasting copper and salt. He adjusted the satchel in his lap so the old leather wouldn't squeak too loudly, painfully aware that even the smallest sound drew attention. Across the room, the teller who had dismissed him now leaned close to another client, voice lilting with false intimacy. She touched the edge of the counter lightly, smiling with teeth displayed in a perfect arc. She didn't have to force it for him, of course. Her smile had vanished the moment his paperwork was involved. Everett watched her gestures from the corner of his eye, his jaw tightening with shame he had no outlet for. Then, abruptly, his attention snapped to a commotion at the main counter. A second teller, one he hadn't dealt with before, held his paperwork aloft with 2 pinched fingers, the gesture clearly designed to draw the eyes of the room. She announced in a slightly raised voice that the transaction was on hold for review, that it required extra verification. The word seemed carefully chosen to be just polite enough not to be an accusation, but dripping with the implication that something about it was wrong, suspect. The manager, standing at her side, nodded sagely as though this was expected. His voice was lower, but Everett could still hear it because he was listening so hard his ears rang. "Put it in the compliance file," he instructed, gesturing vaguely at a gray plastic tray on the side desk already cluttered with stray papers. The teller dropped it there with a careless flick, the silver clip Everett had shined so carefully catching the light for a moment before it was buried under newer, shinier documents. A muffled laugh bubbled up from somewhere behind the counter, quickly choked off but unmistakable. The sound curled around Everett's ribs like a clamp. He felt the warmth drain from his face. He shifted minutely on the chair, eyes down, trying to disappear into the plastic, into the floor, into nothing. But disappearing wasn't an option. Not here. The security guard's weight shifted minutely, his boots scuffing on the tile, bringing Everett's focus snapping back. The guard wasn't talking. He didn't have to. His posture was an accusation in itself. Everett swallowed, the movement loud in his own ears, and forced his hands to relax before they shook. He tried not to look at the other customers, but he felt them watching. They didn't stare outright. That would have been too honest. Instead, they threw sidelong glances like they were assessing a spilled drink or an unfortunate stain. A man in a gray wool coat whispered something to the woman beside him, and they both angled their bodies just slightly away. A mother pulled her son closer to her hip when he pointed toward Everett with the innocent curiosity of a child who hadn't learned the rules yet. She didn't scold him out loud. She just shushed him and turned him gently but firmly, using her body as a barrier. Everett couldn't blame the boy. He could only hate the system that taught that reaction so early. At the counter, the teller who had set off the announcement was busy again, voice bright and cheerful as she welcomed the next guest. The transformation was seamless, effortless. She adjusted her badge with a flick, smoothed her hair behind one ear, and offered a wide smile that Everett had never seen pointed in his direction. The manager leaned in to confer with her, their conversation low, but their eyes flicking toward Everett's paperwork on the tray more than once. He watched as they stacked new forms on top of his, burying it beneath a layer of bank-branded folders. They didn't want to see it. They didn't want to deal with it. They just wanted it gone. Everett clenched his teeth until his jaw ached, willing himself not to react. Reacting would be worse than humiliating. It would be dangerous. He remembered the guard. He remembered the eyes on him. The security guard hadn't moved far. His arms remained folded across a chest that looked carved from granite, one boot heel propped against the wall in lazy dominance. But his eyes stayed locked on Everett with unbroken focus. It wasn't vigilance for safety. It was ownership over the possibility of force. Everett's jaw tightened. He kept his head bowed just enough to show submission, because anything else would be a challenge he couldn't win. He heard the sounds of the bank around him, the muted beeps of teller stations, the slide of bills across counters, the small talk offered freely to those who belonged. The teller who had loudly declared his forms suspect now laughed with another customer, her voice low and intimate as she promised expedited service for their needs. Everett remembered her voice when she'd spoken to them, how it had turned hard and cold without so much as a raised volume. He hadn't given her any reason to be suspicious beyond the evidence of his existence. The thought sat like a stone in his gut. Then he heard his name. His heart lurched, hope flashing before it was extinguished. The manager hadn't come to help. He'd come with a thin-lipped expression, holding the bundle of Everett's papers in one hand like they were something that might stain his fingers. He called Everett forward with a crook of his finger. No greeting, no polite smile. Everett stood carefully, shifting the satchel against his side, moving slowly enough not to make the guard tense further. The manager didn't offer him the main counter space. He led him to the side, near a low table covered in clutter and old pens with cracked plastic. Everett had to hunch slightly to lean over it. The manager didn't even face him fully when he spoke. Instead, he kept his eyes on the paperwork, shuffling it slowly, voice pitched just loud enough to make sure the people in line behind them could hear. He said there were issues with Everett's request. He said the bank had flagged inconsistencies that needed further investigation. Each term felt like a slap. They weren't outright accusations, but they weren't far off. Everett felt the eyes at his back multiply, saw the way shoulders shifted uncomfortably, heard the hush spread like oil on water. His lips parted, but no words came out. He knew anything he said could be twisted, so he swallowed instead, his throat working around the bitter taste of humiliation. The manager kept talking. He explained that Everett's access to his account would be temporarily suspended pending this investigation. He said it in the cool, unruffled tone of a man who delivered bad news for a living, but whose voice betrayed a curl of satisfaction at its edges. Everett's heart dropped like a stone into his stomach. Suspended, frozen, denied. He felt a tremor run through his fingers and pressed them harder into the satchel. This wasn't just being asked to wait. This was them telling him he had no right to his own money, that they could take it away on suspicion alone. He felt heat rising in his chest, panic pressing against his ribs, but he fought to keep his expression blank. The manager didn't pause to see if he understood. He simply turned, gesturing to the teller, who handed him a printed slip of paper that bristled with legalistic language. Everett took it with shaking fingers, eyes blurring as he read words like account hold, compliance review, and customer notification. It might as well have been in another language. What he heard was, "You don't belong here. You don't deserve this. We don't trust you." He tried to swallow, but his throat had closed up. The teller didn't even look at him as she handed over the paper. She glanced instead at the next customer, her smile lighting up, voice going warm and inviting once again. Everett forced himself to step back from the counter, his body screaming to run, to shout, to demand what was his. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. The security guard shifted his stance meaningfully, reminding Everett that he wasn't the only one making decisions in this room. The guard's posture said, "Try it." The teller had smiled as soon as he was gone, her eyes brightening as she greeted the next customer with warmth he hadn't been offered for even a moment. Everett closed his eyes, feeling them sting. He kept his head low so no one would see. He forced his chest to rise and fall in slow measured beats, trying to master the trembling that threatened to spill over into his shoulders. He couldn't let them see it. He couldn't give them any reason. The security guard watched him carefully. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His entire stance was the promise of consequence. He shifted once, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a crackle of tension through the air. Everett caught it from the corner of his eye and stilled instantly, knowing even now that compliance was his only weapon, that rebellion would be crushed before it was even formed. He tried to focus on the satchel in his lap, on the way the cracked leather felt beneath his palm, on the faint lines of wear and age that told the story of someone who made do, who took care of things, who stretched every dollar until it squeaked. The story of a man who had earned what little he had. But none of that mattered here. It hadn't saved him. It hadn't even slowed the process that had stripped him of his rights while pretending it was policy. The door buzzed and hissed open and closed repeatedly as new customers entered, a soft chorus of greetings rising and falling that seemed to scrape across Everett's skin. Each time the cold draft hit him, he flinched minutely, but he didn't move. He didn't dare. Then the manager reappeared, striding across the floor with a smooth, confident gait, the navy suit moving in sharp lines. He barely glanced at Everett as he approached the security guard. They exchanged a few quiet words Everett couldn't hear, but he saw the guard's chin dip in a short nod. That was all it took. The guard pushed away from the wall with deliberate slowness, his boots clicking across the floor in a pattern that sounded to Everett like a countdown. He stopped in front of Everett, close enough that the smell of starch and synthetic cologne filled the air between them. Everett's stomach clenched. The guard didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch thick and heavy until Everett's heart pounded painfully in his chest. Finally, the guard tilted his head slightly, just enough to make clear that Everett was expected to stand. Everett swallowed hard. He moved slowly, carefully, pushing himself upright with a kind of deliberate caution that said he wasn't resisting. His knees trembled under his weight. He held the satchel tight against his ribs like a child clutching a worn toy for comfort. The guard didn't touch him. He didn't need to. His mere presence herded Everett forward. He angled his body slightly, forcing Everett to shuffle sideways until he cleared the space between the row of chairs and the rope line that divided the lobby. The customers parted just enough to let him through, eyes pointedly avoiding his, averted with the well-practiced skill of people determined not to see. Everett felt their attention anyway, prickling across his skin like static. He heard the tiny huffs of disapproval, the polite coughs to cover discomfort, the shuffle of feet eager to get out of the way. The teller who had first handled him watched from behind the counter, her lips pressed into a prim line, her gaze flat and unblinking. She didn't speak, didn't intervene, didn't even pretend to be sorry. She simply observed his forced departure like a job completed. The manager's posture near the teller station relaxed slightly, his arms crossing over his chest, a signal that the disruption was being handled appropriately. Everett's cheeks burned with heat that had nothing to do with the cold air from the door. His vision blurred momentarily, but he blinked it back viciously. He wouldn't give them the tears. He wouldn't feed the story they wanted to tell about him. The security guard moved to his side, steps in perfect time with Everett's own. He didn't have to lay a hand on him. He simply walked close enough that it was clear Everett had no choice about leaving. They crossed the lobby in a silence that buzzed like a live wire. every footstep a confirmation of Everett's exile. When they reached the automatic doors, they slid open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final insult. The wind from outside rushed in, pulling at his shirt, chilling his damp skin instantly. The guard turned slightly, one arm extended in a gesture so false polite it made Everett's stomach roil. Everett stepped through, the threshold feeling like a boundary between worlds. He turned once involuntarily, eyes scanning the bank he had once considered his own, the place where his money sat frozen and unreachable. He saw the line of customers who immediately stepped forward to reclaim their places, the staff whose postures relaxed as the danger passed, the manager whose eyes slid away, already forgetting him. But as he took a breath, heavy and deliberate, something stirred within him. Not despair, but resolve. The bank had tried to erase him, to reduce him to a problem to be controlled, ignored, and discarded. They had built walls to keep him out, locked doors that promised safety only for some. But Everett had not been destroyed. He was far from broken. Inside the building, back at the polished marble floors and plush chairs where money changed hands with ease, the story was already shifting. Word of the incident had reached the upper echelons of the bank's corporate hierarchy faster than anyone had expected. A dossier quietly circulated, containing not just Everett's frozen papers, but a full accounting of his accounts, a staggering portfolio worth billions, held across multiple international trusts and managed through layers of sophisticated financial instruments. The realization sent ripples of shock and panic through the bank's leadership. This was no ordinary customer. He was a titan cloaked in modesty, a force with the power to move mountains of capital with a single decision. The executives scrambled, their earlier dismissal now replaced by urgent conference calls and emergency strategy sessions. The bank's reputation was at stake. The system that had so casually shut Everett out was now the subject of scrutiny and potential overhaul. In the days that followed, the CEO of Imperial Federal Bank issued a statement acknowledging the incident, carefully worded to avoid admitting fault, but promising a thorough review of policies and practices to ensure inclusivity and respect for all clients. Meanwhile, Everett had moved on quietly but purposefully. Using the very influence they had tried to ignore, he initiated the transfer of billions of dollars away from the institution that had so clearly rejected him. Accounts were closed. Investments were redirected. Partnerships were severed. Overnight, the bank's liquidity tightened, its stock price faltered, and whispers of scandal began to circulate in the highest circles of finance. The city's financial district buzzed with speculation. News outlets picked up the story, not about a nameless customer denied service, but about a man who refused to be invisible. A man whose wealth and power shattered the illusion that those in control were untouchable. Back outside the bank where it had all begun, Everett stood with quiet satisfaction. He did not gloat. He did not seek revenge. What he sought was justice, a reckoning not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been told they did not belong. The satchel at his side was still worn, still marked by years of hardship, but it carried a new weight now, the weight of possibility, of change. The streets hummed with life around him, indifferent yet full of potential. As Everett turned away from the bank, he knew the fight was far from over. The systems of power were entrenched and stubborn, but every act of resistance carved a path for those who came after. The message was clear. Injustice might be persistent, but so too was the resolve to confront it. Respect and dignity were not privileges for the few, but rights for all. And no matter how deeply buried, the truth would always find a way to surface. The bank had underestimated Everett Langston. They had seen only the surface, judged by appearances, dismissed without understanding. But in the end, he had the final word, not through anger, not through violence, but through the quiet, unyielding power of justice and truth. The city carried on around him, a complex web of light and shadow, hope and struggle. Everett walked forward into that web with steady steps, carrying not just the scars of the past, but the promise of a future where he would no longer be invisible. The end. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to support more content like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot, what moments stood out to you, and what you think should happen next. Also, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your feedback helps us create stories that truly connect.